Chapter 33. The memories of that day felt like they were unfolding in front of Tyler once more, playing out with sharp clarity in his mind. The courtyard had erupted into chaos that day, with agents swarming the area, students and faculty still reeling from the shock of what had just happened. The clash between Miss Thornhill and the students had left everyone shaken, and now the agents of the USSPPO had their sights set on him. Tyler stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as an agent moved toward him, his face stern and unwavering. Before he could make a move, the agent's hand was on his arm, cold and unrelenting. "Tyler Galvin, he needs to come with us," the agent announced in a voice that brooked no argument, as he locked cold, metallic cuffs around Tyler's wrists. The sound of metal clicking into place was like the snapping of a chain in Tyler's mind, shackles that were not just physical, but mental too. "Hey!" Wednesday's voice rang out, fierce and sharp. She stepped in front of the agent, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. "Adele." Adele's head snapped around at the sound of her cousin's voice, her entire body springing into motion. "Adele, they're taking Tyler!" Pugsley cried out from behind her, his voice high with panic as he reached out, trying to push through the crowd. Adele's eyes widened with shock. "No," she shouted, breaking into a run. But before she could reach Tyler, Jerry James stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "What are you doing?" Adele demanded, her voice rising in frustration. "He's just a kid." Jerry's cold, calculating expression didn't waver. "He is a Hyde," he stated matter-of-factly, his tone sharp. The words sliced through the air like a warning, and they hit Adele like a punch to the gut. "But," Adele started, but Jerry cut her off, his voice firm. "He is a Hyde, and that makes him dangerous." Adele felt her frustration building, a tight knot of helplessness forming in her chest. "We have Miss Thornhill in custody now," she argued, stepping closer to him, her eyes burning with intensity. "We can prove that Tyler wasn't acting of his own will. He was being controlled, manipulated." Jerry sighed, his brow furrowing as he stood his ground. "And we can do that, but for now, we need to follow protocol." His words felt like a slap, like a door slamming shut in her face. She couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe that Jerry, someone she had trusted, was treating Tyler like this, as though his past, as though his curse, was enough to define him. "Protocol?" Adele repeated, her voice thick with anger. "So you're just going to lock him up? You know as well as I do that he's not the one to blame. She is the one you need to focus on." She threw a glance toward Miss Thornhill's petrified form, still being held by agents in the background, but Jerry's eyes remained unyielding. Tyler, feeling the tension rising around him, turned his gaze toward his father, standing at the edge of the crowd. He expected to see some sign of support, something, anything that would tell him he wasn't alone. But when their eyes met, Tyler saw nothing but cold disapproval. His father's expression was distant, unreadable, and he didn't move, didn't even flinch. Tyler's chest tightened, and he could feel the Hyde stirring inside him, pushing against the confines of his mind. It was that familiar voice, mocking and bitter, whispering in his head. "Some old man you got there," the Hyde's voice crooned, dripping with disdain. "He's not going to help you. He doesn't even care." Tyler squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voice. The anger surged inside him, but he knew he couldn't give in, not yet. He couldn't let the Hyde take over again. Not when everything was so fragile. Adele, still arguing with Jerry, barely noticed that Tyler had turned away. His body was tense, fists clenched at his sides as the weight of the moment crushed him. He wanted to scream, to lash out at everyone, especially his father, but he didn't. "Tyler." Adele's voice broke through his thoughts, softer now, though still full of urgency. She pushed past Jerry, finally closing the distance between them. "Don't worry, okay? I'm not going to let them lock you up. You just need to be cooperative, alright?" Tyler barely registered her words. He couldn't respond, not when everything felt so wrong, not when his own father had turned his back on him. His silence was all he could offer in response. The agents moved quickly, as if they had no time to waste. Tyler's heart raced as they escorted him toward an armored transport vehicle, its black exterior gleaming ominously in the moonlight. The heavy doors were already open, waiting to swallow him whole. "Come on, kid," one of the agents muttered as they shoved him toward the vehicle, his grip tight on Tyler's arm. Tyler stepped forward without a word, his mind too clouded to think straight, his body moving on autopilot. He could feel the weight of his cuffs biting into his wrists, a constant reminder of what he had become. An outcast. A monster. As the agents shoved him into the back of the vehicle, the doors slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through his skull like a death knell. The vehicle's interior was cold and sterile, lit by harsh, flickering lights overhead. Tyler slumped into the corner, his head pressed against the cool metal, trying to steady his breath. The Hyde was restless. It was all Tyler could do to keep it at bay. Through the vehicle's small window, he caught a glimpse of Adele standing outside. Her eyes were wide with determination, but Tyler could see the uncertainty lurking there, too. She was trying to convince herself that everything would be all right, that she could fix this. But Tyler wasn't sure she could. And deep down, he wondered if anyone could. Back in the present, Tyler felt that same oppressive weight of uncertainty. His father still hadn't moved toward him. The space between them seemed as vast as it had been that day. He knew that no matter how many times he came face to face with it, he would never be able to erase the haunting truth of what he had become, or the silence that stretched between him and his father. As the agents continued to move around the courtyard, Tyler stood with Adele, still distant, still lost in his thoughts. But the sense of being trapped, of being caught between two worlds, was more real than ever before. And the worst part? He wasn't sure which one he could call home anymore. The sharp click of the door unlocking brought Tyler back to the present. His eyes slowly focused on the officer standing in the doorway, a professional, unfeeling expression on his face. "Galvin, it's time to talk," the officer said, his voice flat, like he was simply delivering a routine order. Tyler didn't respond, his mind already swirling with the memories of the courtyard and the weight of his father's cold stare. The chain clinked as the officer cuffed his wrists again, the metal biting into his skin. He barely noticed as they led him down the sterile corridor toward the interrogation room. He was numb, every step feeling heavier than the last. As they turned a corner, he saw her. Wednesday. She was waiting for him by the door, her dark eyes locked onto him the moment he appeared. Tyler's heart skipped, but the chains around his wrists seemed to drag him down with every passing second. "Wednesday," Tyler whispered, his voice almost hollow as he shuffled toward her. He lowered his head to her shoulder, the chains rattling as he moved, his body aching with the weight of everything. Wednesday didn't flinch, but there was a quiet concern in her gaze as she looked at him, her sharp features softened by worry. "Adele's working on your case," she said, her voice low but steady. "How's the monster treating you?" Tyler's lips parted, but before he could speak, the Hyde's voice cut through his thoughts, dark and mocking. "I've been really behaved, cockroach," the Hyde sneered, his words close to her ear, sending a chill through Tyler. "But my patience is running thin." Wednesday's eyes flickered with a brief moment of unease, but she kept her composure. "Adele's looking to put everything on Miss Thornhill, including the killings," she said, as if trying to ground him in the moment. Tyler's pulse quickened, but it wasn't his voice that came out next. The Hyde's grin spread wider. "Are you gonna watch the interrogation?" the Hyde asked, his tone almost playful. Wednesday gave a slight shake of her head. "Adele says I'm not allowed to. But she'll be on the other side of the mirror if you need anything." "Okay." The Hyde's tone shifted slightly, as if conceding, but the dark undertone was still there. He let Tyler take control again, though it was fleeting. With a soft sigh, Tyler leaned forward and pressed a kiss to Wednesday's cheek. It was brief, but it carried an unspoken weight of gratitude and affection before he stepped toward the door. The cold, harsh reality of the interrogation room loomed ahead. As Tyler walked in, he could hear Adele and Jerry's voices through the glass, their conversation muffled but still audible in the quiet room. Jerry, leaning casually against the wall with his arms folded, shot Adele a raised eyebrow. "Is it just you two?" or is this a family thing? His tone was teasing, but his eyes were sharp, watching everything intently. Adele smirked slightly, the corner of her lips curling up. "We like strong men," she said, her voice cool but playful, a hint of something more behind the words. Jerry let out a low chuckle, but didn't respond. Instead, he pushed himself off the wall and entered the room, the door closing quietly behind him. Tyler sat at the table, the cold metal of the chair digging into him. The shackles around his wrists seemed to weigh more than they should. Jerry didn't waste time. "Sorry about the chains, kid," he said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of detached professionalism. "We're just following protocol." He paused, his gaze narrowing. "You know, everyone says that Hydes are slaves and mindless killers. Do you like killing, kid?" The Hyde spoke before Tyler could process the question. "Yes," the Hyde answered, his voice laced with cold amusement. Tyler, shaking his head in frustration, immediately countered. "No." Jerry raised an eyebrow, looking between the two versions of Tyler with a bemused expression. "Which one is it?" Tyler's eyes were tired but clear, the sincerity in his voice undeniable. "I don't enjoy killing people." His words were firm, rooted in a truth he was desperate to hold on to, even now. But the Hyde wasn't done. His voice was darker now, almost gleeful. "But I did. It felt great." The adrenaline was intoxicating, he added with a maniacal smile that made Tyler want to crawl out of his own skin. Jerry's eyes flickered between them, confusion and something like unease stirring behind his expression. "Did you obediently follow Miss Thornhill's orders, or did you have a choice?" "No, of course not," Tyler said vehemently, the stain of guilt and shame evident on his face. He hated the idea that he had been under her control. Then the Hyde's voice interrupted, casual and cold. "To clarify, I do like hunting people. But I don't like taking orders." He leaned back in the chair, his lips curling into a smile that made Tyler's stomach churn. Jerry's eyes widened slightly. "Why do I feel like I'm talking to two different people?" The Hyde's grin grew even more unsettling. "Because you are. I'm a Hyde, but Wednesday calls me Monster. Adorable nickname, isn't it? The wuss you're hearing is Tyler." Tyler flinched at the words, trying to push the Hyde's voice back into the depths of his mind. "I'm trying to keep myself out of jail," he said with a frustrated edge to his voice, his expression raw. The Hyde wasn't done. "You think I want to be locked up in jail, when I'm already sharing this body with you, Tyler?" His tone shifted, now more insistent. "Don't forget, if we go to jail, we won't be able to see our girl. Do you want that?" Tyler clenched his fists, trying to block out the Hyde's influence, but the darker part of him was already pushing against his resolve. He turned his eyes back to Jerry, who had been watching their exchange with a mix of bafflement and wariness. Jerry stood still for a moment, his eyes darting between Tyler and the Hyde, before he shook his head slightly, clearly unsure of what he was witnessing. "I'm gonna go," he muttered, his voice laden with confusion. "You've got a lot going on in there, kid." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The following morning, Tyler found himself sitting in a new, unfamiliar room, this time with less isolation and more scrutiny. He could feel the eyes of the doctors on him, studying him. Jerry had made the call for a psychiatrist, someone who specialized in Hyde personalities, and now here they were, Dr. Becca, a seasoned psychiatrist, and Dr. Greg Addams, a man Tyler never expected to see in this context, but who, somehow, gave him a sense of comfort amidst the chaos. The door opened, and Dr. Becca walked in, her professional demeanor immediately apparent. Her cool, calculating eyes scanned the room, then landed on Tyler, taking in the young man who seemed to carry an entire storm within him. Behind her, there was an older figure with curly short hair, a clean face, and a well-worn cane. His presence was immediately familiar. "Greg." "Hi there, Tyler," Dr. Becca greeted, her tone measured but not unkind. "I'm Dr. Becca, and this is my colleague, Dr. Greg Addams." Tyler's shoulders sagged with some relief as he recognized the older man. "Uncle Greg?" His voice cracked slightly as the word left his lips. "Good to see you, kid," Greg replied, his voice gruff but warm, offering a slight smile. He took his seat next to Dr. Becca, his cane tapping lightly on the floor as he settled in. Dr. Becca, noticing their familiarity, raised an eyebrow. "You two are acquainted?" "My niece brought him to my nephew's engagement party last spring," Greg explained casually, clearly unfazed by the situation. "So yeah, I know him. But the other guy?" "Not so much." He chuckled under his breath, turning his gaze to Tyler, trying to gauge his reaction. Tyler's curiosity piqued as he leaned forward slightly. "I didn't know you were a doctor," he said, genuinely puzzled. Greg shrugged with a smirk. "What? You thought I'd be some sort of criminal like Faster?" His tone was playful, but edged with a certain roughness. Before Tyler could respond, the Hyde's voice came in, cutting through his thoughts like a knife. "Isn't being a doctor a bit too normal for the Addams family?" the Hyde sneered, his curiosity laced with sarcasm. Greg didn't flinch. He simply smirked, clearly used to the presence of the Hyde. "Adele's a lawyer, and yet she's still part of the Addams family." "No, it's what we do with our professions that makes us who we are. Adele represents outcasts and criminals in court, Gomez invests in odd businesses, and me? I'm a diagnostic and drug researcher. I could really care less about saving lives. Doing research is a legal loophole to scam the government for taxpayer money." He said it matter-of-factly, with no shame in his voice. Dr. Becca was visibly taken aback. "Dr. Addams," she exclaimed, her tone a mix of shock and disbelief. Greg waved it off nonchalantly. "Oh, don't act like politicians don't do it all the time. The only difference is they know judges and other politicians who can cover our asses." He shot a pointed look at Dr. Becca, who was too flustered to respond. While Dr. Becca processed the conversation, Greg's eyes never left Tyler. He could see the faint smirk growing on Tyler's face, the Hyde, no doubt, starting to assert himself again. Greg was a seasoned psychologist in his own right, and he knew how to engage with the Hyde to get what he needed. He was playing the good cop role, keeping the Hyde entertained. Dr. Becca, still trying to maintain control, shifted her gaze back to Tyler, her expression still one of concern mixed with scientific intrigue. "Let's get started, shall we?" Greg said, breaking the silence and turning his full attention to Tyler. Dr. Becca nodded. "We need to understand what's going on here, Tyler. The court needs this information. We need to know about your condition." She used the word carefully, as if afraid to provoke a reaction, but Tyler didn't respond. She glanced at Greg, who leaned forward, offering his most neutral yet open expression. "Tyler, or should I say Hyde?" Dr. Becca started, trying to gauge which personality she was speaking to. "You said you don't like following Miss Thornhill's orders, but you still went through with them. Can you explain why?" The Hyde's voice, low and filled with disdain, answered first. "There is something in me that forces me to obey. It's like an invisible force that forces me to bow my head," the Hyde said, his tone dark, with an almost sadistic twist to it. "It's the one thing I hate more than anything. But I can't help it." Tyler's face twisted in frustration, and he shook his head violently. "That's not true," he shouted, as if trying to push the Hyde out. "I didn't have a choice. I didn't want to follow her. It wasn't me, it was him." His voice cracked under the strain, his hands flexing against the cuffs as if that would release the tension building in his body. Dr. Becca's eyes widened with growing interest. She had encountered many Hyde personalities before, but never one so interactive with its host. Normally, the Hyde's personality remained separate, existing in a kind of fractured state. But here, in this case, the two personalities were clearly at odds, verbally sparring with each other as though they were separate entities, but very much aware of each other. The complexity of Tyler's situation was unprecedented. Greg watched them with quiet amusement, occasionally nodding as if he were watching an intricate dance. "So you're telling me," Greg said, his voice surprisingly calm, "that you've got an invisible force controlling you, Tyler? You've been living under its influence all this time? The Hyde chuckled darkly, clearly enjoying the tension. Control isn't the right word, he said. Asterisk, I'm not a puppet. But I get the urge to do things. And sometimes, I have no choice but to act on it. That's the curse, isn't it? I have to obey something, and it's not you, Tyler. His voice twisted with amusement, as if the idea of control was an illusion. Tyler squeezed his eyes shut in frustration, almost pleading, his voice breaking. I can't stop it. I can't fight him. Dr. Becca was scribbling notes frantically, the situation far more complex than she anticipated. She turned to Greg, her voice slightly trembling with the weight of what they were observing. This is unlike anything I've seen before. These personalities, they're interacting. They're aware of each other and constantly at odds. Most hybrids don't do this, they exist separately. But here, it's like they're constantly battling for dominance. Greg leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Yeah, it's a hell of a mess. But there's something else, isn't there, Tyler? You don't just fight him, do you? Greg turned to the Hyde, his voice low, almost coaxing. You like it, don't you? The Hyde's grin spread across Tyler's face like a predator's smile. Like it? Oh, Greg, you have no idea how much fun it is. The chaos. The destruction. But, Tyler doesn't like it. He never does. And that's the best part. I take it that my niece Wednesday knows about you, too, Greg said, breaking the silence, his eyes still fixed on Tyler. The Hyde laughed, a bitter sound that seemed to reverberate in the quiet room. Of course she does. If she had just tortured this amp for fun like she did her little brother Pugsley, I could have joined all the Addams family fun. Greg's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Wait, you were aware of what was happening even before you were unlocked, he asked, his curiosity piqued. Of course. The Hyde shouted, irritated by the question. You have no idea how many times I wanted to strangle this fool. You have any idea how humiliated I was when he patted himself on the back for catching a small deer, while my little cockroach caught a big-ass moose? The Hyde's voice was almost vicious as it spoke. Dr. Becca, taking notes, furrowed her brow. Your little cockroach? She asked, genuinely confused by the phrasing. Greg immediately recognized the undertone. Are you referring to my niece? He asked, understanding that the Hyde had likely taken a strange, possessive interest in Wednesday. The Hyde's eyes glinted with a twisted sense of pride. Who else would I be referring to? He sneered. Before Tyler shouted, for the last time, she's not your girlfriend, she's my girlfriend. His voice shook with anger, his restraint beginning to break. The Hyde responded with a loud, mocking laugh. No, she's our girlfriend. Tyler stood up, his body tense with frustration. We were dating before you came along. You can't take what's mine, he yelled. The Hyde's grin widened. Too bad for you. She clearly prefers me more. Tyler froze, eyes widening. What made you think that? He asked, voice quiet, almost vulnerable. The Hyde's voice dropped to a taunting whisper. You ever notice that she doesn't complain about me touching her? You couldn't even get in a kiss until months after you started dating. His words hit like a sharp sting. Tyler clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. She doesn't like being touched, you know that. I was respecting her personal space and boundaries. His voice cracked under the pressure. The Hyde smirk deepened. No, you were just too chicken to initiate physical contact, he retorted, taunting Tyler in a way that made his entire body feel like it was burning with frustration. Greg and Dr. Becca exchanged a glance, both shocked by the raw, unfiltered display of inner conflict unfolding before them. Dr. Becca scribbled furiously in her notebook, while Greg reached for his tape recorder, making sure to capture every detail of this chaotic interaction. Dr. Becca's pen shook in her hand as she wrote furiously. She had seen many types of personality disorders, even some extreme cases of dissociative identity disorder. But nothing compared to this constant tug-of-war, these two personalities locked in a perpetual struggle, each one equally powerful but unable to separate from the other. As the session drew to a close, Dr. Becca and Dr. Greg gathered their notes, knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary. "We need to send this to the court," Dr. Becca said, her voice tinged with concern. "This is unlike any case I've ever encountered. It's not just psychological, there's something else happening here. These personalities are too aware of each other." Greg nodded, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. "Yeah. And it's not something that can be solved with regular treatments. This kid's in for a long road ahead." Together, they sent their findings to the court, detailing the unprecedented nature of Tyler's condition. They made it clear that Tyler's psyche was fractured in ways they had never encountered, leaving the court with a choice they hadn't been prepared for: what to do with a young man trapped between two selves, constantly at war, and unable to escape the damage it caused. Scene: the outcast courtroom. The courtroom was filled with tension. The 12 jurors sat quietly, their expressions mixed between disbelief and concern. At the front of the room stood Judge Mortimer Greystone, a man known for his firm but fair judgment. The walls of the court echoed with the murmurs of the audience, all keenly aware of the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. Adele Addams stood, her stance confident, and her eyes fixed on the judge. She held up a folder filled with evidence and studies. "Your Honor, I present this case as a clear example of the failure of those meant to protect Tyler Galpin," she began, her voice strong but calm. "This case is a glaring testament to adult negligence, manipulation, and lack of responsibility." She let the words sink in as she turned to face the jury, her eyes scanning them one by one. "Let us not forget the key figure in all of this, Miss Marilyn Thornhill, also known as Laura Gates. She unlocked Tyler's Hyde, intentionally releasing this dark entity to use him for her malicious plans. But we must also ask ourselves, who allowed this? Who failed to protect him? Who ignored his cries for help?" She paused dramatically. "Mr. Donovan Galpin, Tyler's own father, failed his son at every turn. His son was chained up for 36 hours, yet not once did he go looking for him. He let the clock run out. In his mind, he didn't even notice that Tyler went missing for hours. His son was suffering, locked away, but his father ignored him. Miss Thornhill was out of town, so nobody thought to check in. And yet, here we are, Tyler's life and mental stability destroyed by the incompetence of those who should have protected him." Adele took a breath, her voice growing more intense. "Tyler is not responsible for the deaths caused by the Hyde. He was not the one pulling the strings. It was Laura Gates. It was her orders that Tyler was forced to follow. She manipulated him, made him a tool for destruction. The Hyde was simply the instrument. And now, Tyler is trapped in a war with himself, desperately fighting to reclaim control over his own body. He's terrified of what he's capable of, but he fights every day, every second. Sending him to a mental asylum would only empower the Hyde. And when that happens, you would be condemning him to be lost forever." She turned to the judge, with an intense, pleading gaze. "Tyler is not like the other hybrids we've seen in this courtroom. He has a conscience. He understands the damage that's been done, but he is still fighting, Your Honor. Please, don't take away his will to fight by condemning him." The judge, Judge Greystone, sat silently for a moment, absorbing Adele's words. He glanced at the jury, who appeared moved by her impassioned speech, before looking back at her. "We are all aware of the extreme circumstances here, Ms. Addams," he said. "But we must remember that lives were lost. There must be accountability." Adele did not flinch. "And that accountability lies with Miss Thornhill," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Not Tyler." With that, she stepped back, allowing the room to quiet down as the video evidence was brought forward. As the footage continued, it was clear that Tyler and the Hyde were constantly at war with each other, a tug-of-war for control of Tyler's body. The Hyde twisted Tyler's words, mocking him, while Tyler's face showed nothing but terror and frustration. The scene ended abruptly with Tyler shouting, as his body violently jerked in an effort to break free from the Hyde's influence. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the video ended. The jurors exchanged looks, some visibly shaken by what they had just witnessed. Adele Addams stood once again, her tone quiet but filled with conviction. What you've seen here today is not just a broken mind. It's a child who was pushed too far, manipulated, and abandoned by those who should have been protecting him. He did not want this life. He did not choose this war. But he is fighting. He is still fighting. The verdict. After deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous decision. The foreman stood, addressing the court. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tyler Galpin, not guilty of the charges against him. We hold that the actions which led to the deaths and destruction were under the coercive control of Miss Lauren Hill, aka Laura Gates. The charges of murder, and attempted genocide shall be laid solely at her feet. The judge paused, his gaze shifting to Tyler. As for Tyler Galpin, we recognize the severe psychological trauma he has suffered. The court recognizes that he is not to blame for the actions of the Hyde. His mental state was manipulated, and he was a victim in this case. We therefore recommend that Mr. Galpin be assigned to a willing outcast home, where he can receive proper care and support. The termination of parental rights from Donovan Galpin to the outcast court is also hereby ordered, as his fitness as a parent has been called into question. Judge Greystone turned his attention to Tyler, his voice softening. Tyler, you are not responsible for what happened here. We will make sure you get the help you need. But you will not be abandoned again. Jerry James, who had been observing from the gallery, nodded with a mix of relief and sadness, knowing that Tyler's battle was far from over, but it was at least beginning on a path toward healing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the gavel struck. Tyler, for the first time, seemed to breathe a little easier, knowing that, at least for now, the war inside him had been acknowledged. As the court session ended, the final words of Judge Greystone hung in the air. Let it be known that this court has made a stand, not just for justice, but for mercy. Scene, Tyler's reaction in the courtroom. Tyler sat there, the verdict ringing in his ears, as the jury delivered their decision. His eyes widened when the judge pronounced the termination of his father's parental rights. It felt like a heavy weight lifting, but also a gaping void opening up. He'd never imagined the court would go that far. Termination of parental rights, what does that mean? Tyler asked, his voice shaky but filled with genuine confusion. The Hyde's laughter echoed in his mind, dark and mocking. It means we no longer have to listen to that old man, the Hyde sneered, a low, guttural laugh following his words. No more do this, Tyler, or why can't you be normal? It's just us now. Tyler's hands balled into fists as he tried to focus on the words, trying to drown out the Hyde's voice. But, how is that going to work? Who's going to take us in now? The Hyde's voice softened with a twisted amusement. Who knows? Maybe we'll be free of all these chains, finally. But there was something else in his voice, something curious. It almost felt like the Hyde was waiting for an answer too, as if even he didn't know where they would go from here. Scene, a few days later, Tyler's release. Tyler walked out of the USSPPO detention facility, his mind still spinning from everything that had just happened. The weight of the verdict hung over him like a cloud, but there was a strange sense of freedom in the air, too. He'd been through hell, but somehow, for the first time in his life, it felt like he might finally get a chance at peace, or at least a chance to try. But as he stepped into the bright light of the outside world, he froze. A sleek black car, gleaming under the sunlight, was parked just ahead of him. Tyler blinked in disbelief, rubbing his eyes as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Standing by the car were none other than Morticia and Gomez Addams. Tyler's heart skipped a beat. Beside them, there was Wednesday, serene as always, and Pugsley, his mischievous grin impossible to miss. Tyler's breath caught in his throat. Mr. and Mrs. Addams. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice unsure, like he was still trying to process this new reality. Pugsley, bouncing on his feet with excitement, answered before anyone else had the chance. We're here to pick you up, of course, he said with a wide, mischievous grin, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Tyler blinked in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if he didn't quite understand what was happening. Wait, you mean? Gomez, always the optimist, took the opportunity to throw an arm around Tyler's shoulders and pull him into a hearty, warm hug. You're going to be living with us from now on, my boy, he said with a bright smile, patting him on the back with a resounding thud. Welcome to the family. Tyler stood frozen for a second, his heart racing. He couldn't believe it. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a place where he truly belonged. A family. And then, the Hyde's voice broke through, jubilant and full of energy. Now this is more like it. The Hyde practically jumped with joy inside Tyler. A whole new world of chaos, with no old man to get in our way. Let's celebrate, shall we? There was a sinister edge to his enthusiasm, but Tyler couldn't help the relief that flooded him at the thought of no longer being under the thumb of his father. Tyler's lips twitched into a hesitant smile, and without thinking, he reached up and slapped Gomez on the back. All right, I guess I'm in. Morticia stepped forward, her usual grace in full bloom as she placed a hand on his shoulder. You're safe with us now, Tyler, she said, her voice calm but full of assurance. Wednesday, standing slightly apart from the rest, simply nodded. We'll be fine, she said quietly, her gaze holding Tyler's for a long moment before she turned to look toward the car. With one last cheerful wave, Gomez opened the door to their gleaming black 1950 Cadillac. Morticia entered first, elegant as ever, while Pugsley and Wednesday slid in with ease. Tyler hesitated, glancing at the sleek car before looking at the Addams family once more. A strange sense of belonging surged through him, something he hadn't felt in so long. Then, with a deep breath, Tyler finally climbed into the car, sliding into the seat next to Wednesday. The Hyde's laughter echoed in his mind again, this time not filled with malice, but with something like exhilaration. Now, this is freedom, Tyler. Now we can truly be who we are. As the Cadillac engine roared to life, the family car sped off into the distance. Tyler looked out the window, the open road ahead feeling like a strange new beginning. A sense of peace, however fleeting, settled over him as the first snowfall. And as the car drove off into the distance, Tyler realized, he didn't know where this road would lead. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. Tyler blinked in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as if he didn't quite understand what was happening. Wait, you mean? Gomez, always the optimist, took the opportunity to throw an arm around Tyler's shoulders and pull him into a hearty, warm hug. You're going to be living with us from now on, my boy, he said with a bright smile, patting him on the back with a resounding thud. Welcome to the family. Tyler stood frozen for a second, his heart racing. He couldn't believe it. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a place where he truly belonged. A family. And then, the Hyde's voice broke through, jubilant and full of energy. Now this is more like it. The Hyde practically jumped with joy inside Tyler. A whole new world of chaos, with no old man to get in our way. Let's celebrate, shall we? There was a sinister edge to his enthusiasm, but Tyler couldn't help the relief that flooded him at the thought of no longer being under the thumb of his father. Tyler's lips twitched into a hesitant smile, and without thinking, he reached up and slapped Gomez on the back. All right, I guess I'm in. Morticia stepped forward, her usual grace in full bloom as she placed a hand on his shoulder. You're safe with us now, Tyler, she said, her voice calm but full of assurance. Wednesday, standing slightly apart from the rest, simply nodded. We'll be fine, she said quietly, her gaze holding Tyler's for a long moment before she turned to look toward the car. With one last cheerful wave, Gomez opened the door to their gleaming black 1950 Cadillac. Morticia entered first, elegant as ever, while Pugsley and Wednesday slid in with ease. Tyler hesitated, glancing at the sleek car before looking at the Addams family once more. A strange sense of belonging surged through him, something he hadn't felt in so long. Then, with a deep breath, Tyler finally climbed into the car, sliding into the seat next to Wednesday. The Hyde's laughter echoed in his mind again, this time not filled with malice, but with something like exhilaration. Now, this is freedom, Tyler. Now we can truly be who we are. As the Cadillac engine roared to life, the family car sped off into the distance. Tyler looked out the window, the open road ahead feeling like a strange new beginning. A sense of peace, however fleeting, settled over him as the first snowfall. And as the car drove off into the distance, Tyler realized he didn't know where this road would lead. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. Like, comment, and subscribe to be notified for updates on this series.